Hi, Coach Bob Peter here. I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview specifically for the Excellence for Learning DISC student report. So excited to have you review this information and put your report to work today. So we'll get started. And like I said, this will be about a half an hour of time to get through the introduction and most of your report information. So training objectives for today is basically to understand the DISC model, and I'll provide an overview of that for you, as well as identify your personal communication style, and then hopefully be able to kind of recognize other styles and be able to put your understanding of the DISC to work as far as adapting your style. So again, with DISC, there's no good or bad styles. There's just simply, hey, this is where I'm operating from. I'm a mix of these four things. How do they show up in regards to the situations that I work in and the people that I work with? And then how do I want to adapt that style? Maybe tweak a few things that is going to be helpful in regards to interactions and communications. Okay, so those are the things that we want to kind of key in on utilizing the DISC report. All right, so some information that should be accessible to you, you should have available for working through this training session. One is your Excellence for Learning student report. So I'll be referencing the report information. Also, we forwarded a Insights to DISC handout or worksheets, if you will, that have some additional information related to the DISC model that you'll be able to utilize in today's session, as well as any follow-up work utilizing the DISC model moving forward. All right, so make sure you have those two things for reference. And as I mentioned, I'll be referencing various pages in both documents as we move through the training today. So let me provide an overview of the DISC model. DISC, dominance, influence, steadiness, compliance, or conscientiousness is what the four letters stand for. And basically DISC is a measure of behavior, how we do what we do. So dominance has to do with how we approach problems and challenges. And again, this will be plotted on your graph, which we'll take a look at in just a little while. So wherever your D factor is plotted, it might be plotted between 0 and 50 or 50 and 100, but everybody has a plot point somewhere, and that will determine basically how do you approach problems and challenges related to the DISC style. Influence has to do with approaching people and relationships. Steadiness has to do with approaching the pace of the environment, as well as kind of plans and working plans, if you will. And compliance has to do with procedures and again, process. Those are the things that we kind of want to look at when we're talking about the C factor, the compliance factor. All right. So these are the things that we'll get into a little bit more depth on as we move through the DISC profile. Now, one of the benefits of DISC is it's applicable for not only professional purposes, but also on a personal basis. So one of the things that I like to do with people is just have you think of any person that's close to you. I could use my wife as an example. You could use a parent, you could use a friend, you could use a relative. It doesn't make a difference. But DISC is fairly simple. So we ask basically two sets of questions to determine what someone's core behavioral style is. And when we say core behavioral style, it means that they have a lot of one of these factors in their particular style makeup. And we'll explain that a little bit further when we take a look at the graphs, okay? The first question is, do they have more of an introverted or extroverted style? All right, so if I use my wife, Michelle, as an example, she has more of an extroverted style. She's willing to share her emotions. She's fairly engaging. You're going to know what's kind of on her mind and what she's thinking. So she's over there on the right-hand side of this particular graphic, if you will. All right. The second question we ask, does the person focus on relationships or do they focus on more tactical things, right? So with that being task or process-oriented things. If they're more people and relationship-centered, as my wife is, then she would fall down there as an extroverted, people-oriented style into that I quadrant, or she would have a core style I, okay? If you have somebody who's more introverted and task or tactical oriented, they would fall into that C quadrant as an example. All right. So whoever you thought about, again, you can kind of think through these two questions, introverted, extroverted, which side of the box, and then things or people in regards to up or down across that horizontal axis. And you could probably best guess what that person's style is. And after today's training, you should be a little more familiar with the model, making this even easier, okay? And this information, by the way, as we're moving through the training, up in the right-hand corner of my PowerPoints, you'll see page numbers referenced. So if it's referenced here, this is going to be the page number in the participant handout. If there's any page numbers referenced, for your reports, it would have a little R next to them. Okay, so again, page numbers in the participant handout, and then page numbers for the report will have a little R next to them, but all of those will be flagged in the PowerPoints as we move through this information. So basically, DISC is a communication filter. You communicate outwardly with your DISC style, whatever combination that is, wherever you fall on the DIS and C graphs. And I communicate or receive that information with my DISC style. So where there's some friction lots of times is the differences between our styles and expectations of communication and the information that we're sharing, specifically around not only the content, what's said, but how it's said, which is the pace, the tone, and the body language. So one of the things we want to keep in mind is a lot of times if there's a communication issue or challenge or someone that's a little bit more difficult to work with or communicate with, it might be stylistic. And if it is, we can kind of put our DISC information to work for us to help us out. Let's take a look at your graphs. So again, if you're can reference your reports, okay, page 9 of your actual Excellence for Learning student feedback DISC reports. If you have access to that, either if you printed out a copy, that's fine. You want to flip to page number 9. If you're looking at your report split screening with this particular presentation, that's fine as well, but you want to reference page number 9 in your report for your graph 1 and your graph 2 style insights graphs, and we'll take a look at those. There's also additional information in your participant handout on pages 5 and 6 regarding the information that I'll cover here, okay? Graph number 1 is your most adaptive graph. And again, this is what we'll say is your most changeable or your adaptive graph, which is graph number 1. Graph number 2 is your natural or core style graph, and this is going to be the least changeable graph, all right? So we'll adapt graph 1 in situations and things, but if we're just being who we are, technically, we'll be looking like or resembling graph number 2. Okay, so graph number 2 is what we focus on because if we can operate from our comfort zone, that's less stress. It means we're not adapting our styles, and this is kind of a majority of the reports generated from the graph 2 information in those 4 plot points, right? Your core style indicator, as I mentioned earlier, or your DISC style indicator, if you will, would be the highest data point plotted on graph number 2. You can see in this example, that's going to be the I factor with a score of 84. If you have 2 factors that have similar scores, that's okay. You just say that I'm an IS style or a C style or whatever it is. Okay, but again, the highest data point in graph number 2 will be your DISC style indicator or your core style indicator. The midpoint line, that 50% line, does have significance in regards to 2 things. One is the intensity level of the factors. The further away from the energy line, either up or down the scale, the more intense those particular behaviors are and more consistent across different situations. So in this example, the I factor is the most intense factor for this person. So as we talk about the I factor information, those particular characteristics would be something that we see on a fairly readily basis across different types of situations for that particular person. The S factor information related to the S factor would be seen less often or less consistently based on the score of 58 being fairly close to that energy line of 50%, right? When you hear me reference high style, that would mean data points above the line, okay? Lower styles being data points below the line. We'll look at some descriptor pages that describe the high side of the graph. We'll talk about those. And the descriptors associated with the lower side of the graph would just be the opposite descriptors. The scores are not good or bad. A 31 is not worse than an 84. It's just a different score, meaning something different in the DISC model. All right. We're going to go through each of the 4 factors and give you a little information related to those. Along the way, I'm going to encourage you to stop the video and spend a few minutes doing a couple quick exercises with your report information. Let's look at the D factor first. And again, if you're looking inside of the handouts, it'll be page number 7. There's information related to the D factor. So when we talk about the high D factor or the dominant factor, if you're plotted above that 50% line on your graph number 2, which we just covered, you would have some D in your style. If it's the highest factor, then you're a core style D style, which means you probably resemble some of this information. High Ds are very active and super results oriented. They're very direct and to the point with high senses of urgency. The needs driven behavior for the high D, if you're filling in the boxes on handout number 7 or page 7 of the handouts, needs driven behavior is challenge, All right. So again, high D styles prefer to be in situations that offer new and different challenges on a regular basis, kind of stretch the bar, if you will, pretty aggressive goals. All right. The stress reliever for the high D would be other activities. So again, stepping away from something that they're working on and getting busy with something else. Expectations of others is extremely high based on outcomes and results. That's all. So in the work environment, it's a very extroverted, tactical style. It means that they want there to get it done, nothing else. And so again, don't take it personal, but they're not there to shoot the breeze or socialize. It's all about tasks, getting things accomplished, and moving forward with the agenda. Okay, so again, they can come across as fairly assertive, and if you have a high S style, opposite side of the wheel, maybe borderline um, aggressive communication, but it's not necessarily aggressive. Just remember, you're hearing it from a different style perspective. Okay, so for the high Ds, emotions associated with the high D, anger, frustration, those types of things. It doesn't mean that other styles don't feel them. It just means the high Ds express them on a fairly regular basis. Conflict, they're the only style that doesn't take conflict personally. Have a tendency of engaging. And again, doesn't mean that they're manage conflict well, it just simply means they're willing to engage. All right. All right, as we move forward with the D information, the high D style information, tips on communicating with the high D can include being very direct, using a very logical approach. Again, keep communication to what needs to be focused around results and outcomes. They're very concerned with, is it done versus, tell me more about why it isn't or where we are with things, right? So again, keep it really short to the point. I always say if you're scheduling a meeting with a high D style, if it's a half hour, get done in 10 minutes. That's a good thing. Okay. Be prepared for bluntness, lack of empathy. Again, that focus on outcome results sometimes comes across as not really caring about people's opinions. Might not be the case, but again, just something to keep in mind with that particular style. All right. If your D factor scores below the energy line, below 50%, on the graph number 2, then again, opposite flip side of challenge and approaching challenges, problems, you're going to do that from a much more non-confrontational, patient, and direct perspective. All right. You're going to bring, listening skills, probably some calmness under stress. Again, remembering that the high D folks are willing to demonstrate frustration and anger. That means the low D style folks have tendencies of maybe moderating that a little bit more. Okay, so it's going to be the opposite side of the graph for each of these different factors. All right. Taking a look, and this is where I'll ask you to pause the training here and take a look at your general statements section of your report. That's going to be pages 4 to 5 of your feedback report and the Excellence for Learning DISC report. I'm going to have you read down through your general statements, and I'd like you to highlight 5 of those general statements that resonate with you. And also just think a little bit about how do they show up for you as a student or in the workplace? How did these things particularly show up? And if you have an opportunity to chat about these with your colleagues or your cohort members, that would be a great idea. Maybe share a little bit more of this information together. So go ahead, hit pause on the recording and take a look at your report and then pick it back up. We'll move into the I factor information. All right, the I factor is extroverted factor, relationship focused. All right, so influence, you can see here percentage of the population if you're following along on page 9 of your handout report. Needs-driven behavior for the high I is interaction with people, very optimistic, enthusiastic, kind of the high fivers, if you will. All right. Stress relievers, talking things out, engaging with others, expectations of others is high, similar to the D, but not based on results. It's based on trust. High I's generally assume people are going to do what they say, and people are good people, right? So that's where we're coming at as a high I style. Conflict is to kind of choose to negotiate it. They like when people get along, but if that doesn't work, they really hate when people don't or have an issue with them. So they might take flight, if you will, afterwards. So something to keep in mind. If you have a lot of I in your style, that's not going to be a comfortable place for you. Okay. Values to the team, optimism, enthusiasm, and take a look at tendencies under stress, because this happens whether you're in a tight educational environment, things start hitting the fan or at work, they can become a little bit self-promoting over unrealistic. And that's a problem as far as credibility is concerned as well. If you happen to have a lot of I in your style, you're a core style I person, again, scored very highly on that graph number 2 under the I factor. All right. Things to keep in mind with the high I styles: allow time for relating and socializing. So unlike the high Ds, small talk is good. They like to make connections with people. Be open to their opinions and observations. They like to share things. They're very passionate about, sharing information and ideas and engaging people in those conversations. Be prepared that they may be a little overly optimistic sometimes, have a tendency of I'll say, hunger for the limelight, meaning they like to be center stage and being able to share what's on their mind. Okay, so they can also take rejection very hard, personalizing that. Like I said, high D's not so much the case, high I's a little bit more so. If you're on the low side of the descriptor, again, versus working with people, your preference could be that you kind of work solo and then regroup with folks as needed. Okay, values to the team, much more objective, right? We said high I's tendency to be optimistic, so maybe sometimes unrealistic, where lower I style people would be have a more realistic view of the work. All right. So again, what I'd have you do is just stop the training here and hit the checklist for communicating that's located in your feedback report on page number 6. Identify 3 to 5 communication tips that would be helpful for other people to know about communicating with you. So again, this is your list of hey, these are the things I like people to do when communicating with me. So hit pause, and then we'll get back to the internal factors or introverted factors, S and C, following this exercise. All right, let's take a look at the S factor. We're getting into the introverted factors, S and C. S, introverted, people-oriented, relationship-based, pace and change associated with this particular factor on the high side, okay? Steadiness, if you take a look, 35% of the population. Characteristics, very good listeners, patient, persistent, behind the scenes, loyal, steady, stable. Needs-driven behavior is actually security. So stability and security for the high S, which means, change isn't always their friend unless it's pretty well mapped out and there's a good change management process in place. The stress reliever for the high S is downtime. So stepping away from the stress, engaging in a low key activity of some kind tends to be how they manage the stress, either at school or work or what have you. Expectations of others is low, and this is based on their need to be accommodating and helpful. I like to say a lot of times S folks are very supportive, but they have to be cautious of constantly being a yes person, right? Can you help me? Sure. Can you help me? Yes. And then they end up with too much on their plate. Conflict, they tend to disengage from. So again, IS is not their favorite area as well, similar to the high I's. But when it comes to conflict, they tend to say or do little instead of engaging and being more confrontational. Might be an opportunity for the highest styles to keep conflict productive and healthy. Right. Values to the team, as I mentioned, some of these super dependable, very patient and empathetic. And emotion-wise, they tend to be non-emotional, don't really show a lot of emotion in regards to engagements and things of that nature. So something to be aware of. Just because they don't get excited doesn't mean that they're not feeling excited. It's just they're not showing their excitement. So that's something we want to keep in mind if we're working with a high S style on our team. So again, related to the high S, page number 12 in your handouts, if you're following along there. Tips on communicating: be much more patient, relaxed, laid back in regards to our approach and our engagement. Connecting as an individual on a relationship basis is important, as well as the focus on the work. Plan the work, work the plan. So laid out structure around kind of what we're talking about and making sure that follows suits and includes how it's impacting other people. Okay. If you're a lower style S, the high side is consistent pace, steady, stable. So down below is much more flexibility around kind of energy and adaptability in regards to the workplace or versatility. A little higher energy. If you have a D scored above the energy line, right, above that 50% line, and S below the 50% line, that is actually your urgency scale. So the bigger the discrepancy there, higher D and lower S, the higher sense of urgency that's kind of built into your particular behavior style potential, right? Again, I'm going to have you stop here and do the same thing with the don'ts on communicating. Select 3 to 5 don'ts that you would like to other people to be aware of in regards to communicating with you. So pause here, complete the don'ts exercise, and then we'll pick it up with the C factor indicator. All right, the C factor indicator. Last one, compliance, procedure, process orientation for the C factor. 14% of the population with a high C. It does depend on, of course, jobs and things of that nature. If you get into anybody who is an analyst of any kind, accounting, engineering, there's more high C styles, obviously, percentage-wise, in those mixes of jobs. Accurate, analytical, fact finder, dot your I's, cross your T's, make sure that we have the right information before making decisions. The needs-driven behavior is process. So again, if there isn't one in place, high C's have a tendency of putting one there. The stress reliever is alone time. So again, a lot of times high C styles will choose to kind of separate and go recharge their batteries and then kind of regroup, if you will. Right? Expectations of others is low. Generally speaking, high C style folks think everybody else is wrong and they are right. Lots of times that may be true simply because the high C styles are very analytical, research-based, so they are going to find information that backs up their opinions before providing those opinions. So therefore, they usually question other people's means of, what information's backing up or what data is backing up their particular opinions that they have or that they're sharing, okay? Under stress, be aware, high C's, if you have the high C style factor and that's your core style factor, your questioning could come across as maybe a little overly critical. You're going to be questioning everything. So the high I's are optimistic. On the flip side, high C's tend to come across as pessimistic because they kind of question all ideas and kind of weigh that up against what the options are or how things are already being done as well. Okay. Emotion is fear related to risk. So high C's want to minimize risk to the best of their ability. Conflict responses to avoid it simply because it's more emotional based than fact based lots of times. So it's just not a comfortable place for the high C styles. All right, now continue on page number 14 of the handouts. You can see here communicating with the high C's, use facts and data, follow a very logical approach. Slow your pace to being very methodical to work through specific agenda items, okay? Don't socialize unless that's invited. That's usually a distraction, some of the higher energy styles. So keeping things fairly grounded and following a process that's fairly logical is the best solution for the high C styles. Also providing information ahead of time for review before your meeting can be really, really helpful, okay? Lower C's, again, high C's being fairly skeptical, process-oriented. If you have a low I and a high C, that's an example of someone who's probably skeptical about information and people, so coming across that way. So just be aware of situations when that could be serving you well as situations when it may not. Lower C style folks are going to be more risk takers. They're going to be a little more resilient, out of the box kind of not only thinkers, but doers, if you will. But they might not have the same level of consistency or detail orientation as someone with a higher C style, okay? Last section of your report I'll have you take a look at is basically the study tips section. And again, these study tips just generated based on your DISC style. But if there are a few of these that would be helpful to keep in mind for you from a study perspective or a work perspective, I would just ask you to highlight those and be willing to maybe share those with colleagues or your team groups that you're working with and or family members, friends, whoever. Again, DISC is all about identifying things that are relate to us and then be able to share those with other folks in regards to talking a little bit more about how we can improve communication or our work relationships. All right, the last thing I'll touch base on is the Success Insights wheel. And again, page 11 of your report, you'll see that you have a star and a dot that's plotted in a quadrant of the wheel. I just want to show you how they get there. There's no mathematical equation. There's 60 different wheels or plot points or graphs, if you will, that are plotted on the wheel here. 60 of 384, I believe it is. So again, only a fraction of the wheels graphs generated by the assessment get plotted on the wheel. It is simply a matching exercise. So in this example, you'll see that in quadrant 18, that the graph here looks similar to the bar graph. So again, the D factor being below that energy line, the I factor being above, the S factor being the core style, and even higher, and that C factor being below that energy line. So here in quadrant 18, this graph is the best match to the natural style graph, and actually in this case, also the adaptive style graph, and that is why both the star and the dot are plotted in quadrant 18. So you would just simply take a look at where you were plotted on the wheel, and you'll see that the graph inside of the quadrant that you're plotted in will look or resemble your graph 1 or 2, depending on which graph you're referencing. It will not be an exact match, it would be the best match. So something to keep in mind. Based on that, there's a descriptive wheel here, and you can see based on the style plot and graph plot 18, it's under the supporter quadrant, and these descriptors would be associated with that S style. If you fell in the relator quadrant, it would be teamwork, people orientation, and over there for I, over here under high trust, self-promoting, people contact, so forth and so on. So again, this is also included in regards to the slide handouts. The last thing in your handouts on page number 15, if you're interested in doing so, we plotted someone. I said my wife was a high I. I could plot her up there accordingly on this graph. I could take a look at these descriptors and decide where else do I plot her based on the D-style stuff, problems and challenges, which descriptors describe my wife. And I would say that she's probably just below the energy line under cooperative and conservative. So I would plot her D factor there. The I factor I mentioned is fairly high under demonstrative, enthusiastic. The S factor, she's probably a little bit more mobile, stable, right around the energy line. And the C factor down below, probably unsystematic, I would guess, down below there. So if I plotted my wife's graph, I could then circle back on the do's and don'ts of communications referenced in your handouts that I provided and come up with maybe a tip or two, do's and don'ts of communicating with her particular style factor. And this gives you a quick cheat sheet in regards to communicating with other styles. If you're interested in a quick quiz on the information that you just went through, go ahead, you can scan the barcode. It'll access a quick quiz, literally about 30 seconds or 1 minute, just on some disc information. So feel free to do that if you would like to. And that's the information for today. So if you'd like to connect, I'm on LinkedIn. I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoy your disc feedback report. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions or other information, please get in contact.